I kind of detected their hesitancy. And I said, well, you don't really seem that excited. I want you to be proud of me. My dad said, don't worry, David. We were proud of you.
Hey there, I'm Goli Kalkaran, and this is Lessons from a Quitter, where we believe that it's never too late to start over. No matter how much time or money you've spent getting to where you are, if ultimately you are not happy, then it's time to get out. If you're feeling stuck and you feel like there's gotta be more, there's gotta be a way to feel fulfilled and excited about what you do, then this is the podcast for you. Each week, I will sit down with an inspiring guest who quit their professional career in order to forge their own path and create a life that they love. Hey guys, thank you so much for joining us again. I really appreciate you being here. If you want to connect with me more, follow me on Instagram at Lessons from a Quitter. That's where I'm most active. You can send me a DM. Let me know what you like and don't like about the show. I would love to hear from you guys. I am so excited about the show today. I feel like I have a celebrity on the show, and I think my lawyer friends will fully understand what I'm saying. For the non-lawyers, let me explain a little bit about who my guest, David Lat, is. So David Lat is the editor-at-large and founder of Above the Law, an award-winning website about the legal profession that reaches more than 1 million unique visitors a month. But I don't think that does justice to what Above the Law is. Above the Law is honestly one of the most influential and most read publications by anyone that is any relation to the legal profession. So lawyers, law students, staff, they cover everything from the Supreme Court and politics to what associates are being paid at different law firms, what bonuses look like each year. And so it keeps law firms accountable. One of the articles I was reading about David called him one of the most feared men in the legal profession. And I think that just shows the power of what Above the Law is. And so we'll get into everything about how he started it. But to give you a little bit more background of what he was doing before, David graduated from Harvard College and Yale Law School, where he served as an editor of the Yale Law Journal. After law school, David clerked for a federal judge on the Ninth Circuit. He then worked as a litigation associate in a prestigious law firm in New York, and finally went on to be a federal prosecutor at the U.S. Attorney's Office in New Jersey. While he was a prosecutor, David launched Underneath Their Robes, a blog about federal judges that we will get into in this interview and how that set the stage for Above the Law. His writings have also appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post, among other publications. David's also an author. His first book, Supreme Ambitions, a novel, was published in 2014, and he's gearing up to start writing his second novel. I'm so excited to get into how David left this, quote unquote, prestigious career to start blogging in 2004, 2005, 2006, when it was just starting, and how he has grown it into such a behemoth. So without further ado, let's talk to David. Hi, David. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. Great to be here.
I am so excited to talk about everything that you've done and your journey. But why don't we start back from the beginning and give us a little sense of what led you to go to law school and to become a lawyer?
Yeah, so I think I ended up going to law school for reasons similar to many, at least back in my time. I think the calculus has changed in more recent years. I was a senior in college. I was a humanities major. I majored in English. I didn't really know what to do with myself after graduation. I like to write. I like to argue. So I thought, heck, why don't I go to law school? And of course, there was the narrative that a law degree is very versatile. And it seemed like a great way to buy more time as I figured out what to do with my life. Whether that's a good idea to go nowadays, given the increasing cost of law school and the challenging job market, depending on where you do go to law school, is another story. But I think in a nutshell, that's why I went.
And what was your career like as a lawyer? Can you tell us a little bit about what you did after you graduated law school?
Yeah, so I actually did enjoy my time as a lawyer. My first job was a year clerking for Judge Diarmuid F of the Ninth Circuit out in Portland. He's a great judge, a great boss, and I enjoyed that experience very much. That was actually probably my favorite legal job. Then after that, I worked at Wachtell Lipton, a law firm in New York, for about 2.5, 3 years doing litigation. The firm is known mainly for its M&A practice, but they have a lot of litigation often related to their transactional practice. And then after that, I spent another 2 or 3 years in the U.S. Attorney's Office in New Jersey under then U.S. Attorney Chris Christie. This was an office I had gotten some exposure to when I was a 1L. After my 1L summer, actually, I was a summer intern there, and I just enjoyed the work and the people. I'm originally from New Jersey. I grew up there, and it always struck me as a good place to return to later on in my career. They generally don't take people right out of law school in U.S. attorneys' offices, certainly not that one. And so after I had a couple of years under my belt, the clerkship, my time at Wachtell, I applied to the U.S. Attorney's Office, got an offer, and worked there for a couple of years, where I was mainly doing criminal appellate litigation, handling appeals from convictions, trials. And so that was my legal career before I transitioned out.
Okay, so we'll get to the transition, but during that time, were you thinking about doing something else? Like, were you unhappy as a lawyer, or did you think that you were just going to continue kind of down the path and work as a lawyer for your career?
So I did like my legal jobs overall, but there was a part of me that felt not completely fulfilled. I think it was almost like an itch I just felt I couldn't scratch. I had always enjoyed writing, not just writing legal briefs, but writing in a more freewheeling, open sort of way. I'd been on the newspaper in college where I wrote opinion pieces. I'd been the editor of my high school opinion journal. And when you are working as a prosecutor and writing briefs on behalf of the US government, you're not really expressing your own personal opinions, and you're not really trying to write in any colorful way. So it was that sort of discontent that led me to, while I was still working as a federal prosecutor, start a website, a blog. This was back in 2004 when blogs were starting to emerge and grow in prominence. And that was in some ways my outlet.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about that blog. So it was called Underneath Their Robes, and tell us kind of what the premise was and why you wanted to start it.
Yeah, so I was always fascinated by federal judges, certainly dating back to law school, where judges are depicted in many ways as the heroes of the American legal narrative. They're the ones who gave us Brown versus Board of Education, which desegregated schools. They're the ones who brought us New York Times versus Sullivan, which stood up for free speech. And in my clerkship also, I came to know judges, both personally and professionally, and admired them very much. So I started a blog called Underneath Their Robes, news, gossip, and colorful commentary about the federal judiciary. And it was focused on judges more as people in a way than as handers down of decisions. I wanted to look at the more personal side of them. I wanted to humanize them. So that, I think, was the premise of the site. I like to almost say it was like a People magazine for federal judges.
Yeah, so it had things that I think most people won't typically expect from like a legal blog. I know you had like an art column, or I don't know if it was like a feature on like the hotties on the bench. And it should be noted that you did this blog under a pseudonym. You were anonymous when you were writing this blog.
Yes, because some of the stories were irreverent, kind of one of the ones you just alluded to, and I was still working as a federal prosecutor appearing before federal judges. I decided to do this under a pseudonym. So I called myself Article 3 Groupie after Article 3 of the Constitution, which establishes the federal judiciary, and Groupie as in basically, a fan.
Right.
And I should also mention that to conceal my true identity, I flipped a lot of aspects of my identity. So I am male. I made my writing alter ego female. I was on the East Coast. I gave the Post's West Coast timestamps. I worked in government, and I pretended that Article 3 Groupie worked at a law firm, which was something I knew about having been at a law firm. So that was my disguise, I guess you could say, while I was blogging incognito at Underneath Their Robes.
And Underneath Their Robes became very popular, and you were even kind of corresponding with some of these federal judges. Were you concerned when you were writing it, like that could get you in trouble, or if people find out who you are, writing these colorful pieces? This was very rare in a buttoned up profession like the law. And so I was just wondering, were you scared at all that like people would find out who you were?
Absolutely. I think anyone who does something anonymously or pseudonymously has to carry in the back of their mind the possibility of discovery. It's very hard in this day and age to keep secrets. I don't know when people will be listening to this podcast, but there's this whole thing right now about the author of this anonymous New York Times op-ed criticizing Trump from within the administration. Whoever wrote that should have gone into that knowing full well that they might be discovered. And maybe by the time people listen to this, they will be discovered. But certainly when I started this site, I was concerned, which is why I created this alter ego for myself.
Right.
But I was not perfect at covering my tracks. I thought it was sufficient to have an anonymous website and to have an anonymous email account where I would email with readers and sources, Article 3 groupie at Yahoo and then later at Gmail. But I wasn't very technologically savvy, and I didn't know anything about IP addresses, these 4-digit identifiers that are attached to computing sessions. And so I didn't realize that when I was emailing in my David Lat capacity to friends and in my Article 3 groupie capacity to readers, some of whom were my friends, even though they didn't know, I was actually inadvertently revealing my identity.
So did people find out who you were, or did you announce?
Yes. I think because of the IP address thing, about a year and a half into my doing the site, I started to get emails in the supposedly anonymous account from people who would say things like, oh, hey, I'm coming to Newark. Do you want to step out of the U.S. Attorney's office and grab coffee? Or, hey, how come you don't write more about your former boss, Judge O'Scanlan? And so a couple of readers, a year and a half or so in, had clearly figured out who I was. And at that point, I was quite terrified.
Yeah, so what did you do?
It's weird. I was both very afraid, and yet I did something that, in hindsight, I wonder if it made sense. But here's what happened. So I had struck up a friendship with Jeffrey Toobin, who's the legal affairs writer for The New Yorker. He also appears on CNN doing legal and public commentary. And I had struck up a friendship with him over email like I did with many other journalists who covered the law. And at one point I mentioned I was in the New York area, and he said, oh, well, if you're ever in Manhattan, I would love to grab lunch and I can talk to you about how I made the transition from practicing law to writing about it. And I have great admiration for Jeff as a writer. And so I thought, wow, that sounds great. So I took him up on that. I didn't tell him who I was. I just basically showed up at his offices, at the New Yorker offices at the appointed hour. And he was caught off guard. He did not expect to see a guy as opposed to a woman. And the lunch went great. And at the end of the lunch, he said, people are really into your site and it's widely read. If you ever wanted to reveal yourself as the author of it, I'd love to write a piece about you. And at the time, because I enjoyed my day job, I said, thanks, but no thanks. But after I started to get these emails I mentioned to you, I kind of thought, you know what? If I'm about to be unmasked, if it's only a matter of time, I would rather go out in the pages of the New Yorker with a friendly journalist and in a way where I could frame the narrative, as opposed to some random other person showing screenshots of emails with the IP addresses. So I called Jeff back and I said, that article, I actually would be interested in doing that.
Okay, so you kind of come out in a very grand fashion, like he writes an article. And what happened at your job at the U.S. Attorney's Office?
Yes, it's funny. I did not really think through the consequences. I think I had convinced myself that this wasn't going to be such a big deal because I was so into my alter ego of Article 3 groupie. I convinced myself, well, you know what? It's really she who's been writing these stories, not me. And this is really not a big deal. This is just like a federal prosecutor with a fun hobby or something, like bowling or something. And so I didn't really think about how it could be perceived. So I gave this interview. This was, I guess, in November of 2005, I think. That's the point when shortly thereafter, everything basically hit the fan.
Right. So did you end up getting fired or did they?
So I very well could have been. But Chris Christie, who was U.S. attorney at the time, was actually much more gracious and forgiving about it than he had to be, which might surprise some people who know him for his somewhat temperamental YouTube appearances. But after the site went up, there was all this controversy in the U.S. attorney's office, and I was in all sorts of media publications, and it was sort of this scandal about this federal prosecutor writing this sassy blog that occasionally poked fun at federal judges. I should be clear. Most of Underneath the Robes was actually very positive towards judges. There was only occasional low-level snark here or there. It was mainly positive, but be sure, not very buttoned up, as you were saying, and so that caused a stir. So there was all this controversy. There was this scandal, basically. And after this broke, I went to a more senior lawyer in the U.S. Attorney's Office, and I said to him, he was a mentor of mine, what should I do? I'm really scared. I'm terrified. What should I do? So he advised me to, A, shut down the site, basically, and B, go talk to Chris and essentially grovel. So I did that. I put the site behind a password. I didn't delete it because I don't want to lose a year and a half worth of content, but I put it behind a password, gave nobody the password. and called up Chris's assistant and asked if I could meet with him. And at the time, Nancy said, well, Chris is not ready to meet with you.
Oh.
So I spent about a week in limbo and agony and kind of feeling really weird around the office with people just kind of giving me weird looks. And then finally, the New York article had gone online Sunday into Monday. I met with Chris that Friday. And that's when he said, okay, David, you've been doing good work here in the U.S. Attorney's Office. You've shut down the site. Let's just go back to the way things were. I talked to the people down in D.C. There weren't really social media guidelines back in 2005. This was a very different situation. They said it's my call as U.S. attorney as to what to do with you. So basically, I was allowed to keep my job, but the site was under a password and I couldn't really write for it anymore. And so that's essentially what I returned to.
So going back really quickly, like when we talk about the site, clearly for you to get this kind of publicity, it had gotten big. Like how big did it actually get? Like how many visitors were you getting at the site when, like at its height?
So it's interesting. It was actually by traffic, never a huge site. It was probably, on a good day, probably a few thousand visitors. Now, of course, the traffic spiked after I became this sort of scandal, although at that point, since I'd put it behind a password, I missed out on a lot of that traffic. But anyway, the site was never huge in terms of traffic. I think it was just the right kind of traffic. It was being read by federal judges. It was being read at the Supreme Court. It was being read by influential legal journalists. It was being read by law firm partners. It was being read by a lot of the right, I guess I put that in quotes, people. And so I think it was almost like a cult kind of a thing, like, a garage band that certain people really love, but it hasn't really actually gone mainstream yet. So that's kind of how I would describe it. It was never huge by traffic.
Right. So it was big within the circles that it pertained to.
Yes, absolutely.
And so what made you decide to finally leave the U.S. Attorney's Office to go be an editor? You went to be an editor at another blog, right? Wachtell.
Yes, that's right. So what happened was, after I got to keep my job, I went back to writing briefs essentially, but I couldn't blog anymore. And after a couple of weeks, months, I guess I realized, you know what? I really missed that creative outlet. I didn't realize how much I missed it until it was gone. And so through some networking, essentially a law school classmate of mine who knew some people, I got in touch with a company that's no longer around, Gawker Media. And at the time, they had a political website called Wachtell, based in DC. And the original founding editor of Wachtell, Anna Marie Cox, was leaving to go work for Time magazine, and they needed new editors. And so I and another journalist, Alex Perrine, who's still a political journalist, were the ones who were picked to fill her shoes. So I left the U.S. Attorney's Office, I left the practice of law, and I started blogging about politics from D.C. as an editor of Wachtell.
Hindsight's 2020, and obviously it turned out wonderfully, and we'll talk about it above the law. But at the time, when you have one of the most prestigious resumes, you went to Yale Law School, you clerked for a federal judge, you worked at a big law firm or a U.S. attorney. When you're leaving to go work at a blog, and again, we're talking about 2005, 2006, when blogging is just kind of emerging, were you ever thinking like, what am I doing? I'm walking away from this career to try something so unknown? Were you scared?
Yes, I was scared. Now, look, don't get me wrong. I was excited. Wachtell was a very prominent site at the time. And in some ways, this was almost like a dream come true. But in some ways, it was really scary because, as your listeners well know, law is a very stable profession. It can often be a very lucrative profession. It's a very prestigious profession. And as you were also saying, back in 2005, 2006, blogging was not really a thing. There were very few people back then who were even making a living as online journalists. And speaking of making a living, my salary was basically on this downward trajectory. I went from Wachtell, which was quite lucrative, to the U.S. Attorney's Office, which was much less so. That was probably a 70, 80% pay cut. And then I took a further pay cut going from government public service, which already wasn't that well paid, to go into blogging. So it was scary financially. It was scary from a sort of credentials, prestige, stability viewpoint. I wondered as I left, could I ever return to the law if this didn't work out? My parents, they are Asian American immigrants. They came here from the Philippines. They're very conservative in some ways in terms of life choices. And I don't think they fully understood what I was going into, how I was leaving this profession that was one of the acceptable ones to go into something that was not really a profession. So yeah, I was very scared.
So how did you deal with that though? Like just your family, I mean, it's one thing for you to be scared, but be also excited and have that excitement and the possibility. But I know a lot of people listening to this and a lot of people that make that jump, a really big struggle is the pressure from family or spouses or friends, colleagues, coworkers that are kind of like, are you crazy? Like, what are you doing?
Yeah, I think at a certain point, it really is just a matter of believing in yourself and believing in your project. I had a conversation with my parents. We went out to dinner. I think it was a Thai restaurant. I was telling them about my decision to leave the U.S. Attorney's Office and go to D.C. to work for this website. And they were really confused, didn't really understand. And I kind of detected their hesitancy. And I said, well, you don't really seem that excited. I want you to be proud of me. My dad said, don't worry, David. We were proud of you. And what I think he meant by that was, oh, you've achieved so much at a young age. We'll always be proud of you. But when he said were past tense, that just slayed me. I just thought, oh, wow. Like, someone who really always wanted approval, especially parental approval. And that was really hard. And so at a certain point, I had to say, you know what? I just think this is the right decision for me and I have to go do it. And, fast forward 12 or so years and my parents now understand what I do and are very pleased and proud, especially since a lot of the kids of their friends now know of the website I now run. And so there is some sort of validation within the community. It's not just some random thing nobody's heard of, but it was hard. And at a certain point, you just need to say, you know what? I believe in this next thing that I've decided to do, and I'm going to go do it.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I think that's really great advice and really the only answer. I think a lot of times people are waiting for some clear path to success and like some new opportunity that's going to unfold and then they're going to make this safe leap, but it's never like that. And so there is a huge risk. And with that risk, it's scary. But if you really want it or if it's something that you're really excited about, you sort of have to believe in yourself and just take that jump.
Absolutely.
Totally agree. Okay, so tell us a little bit about the transition from Wachtell to starting Above the Law.
This was also actually in some ways a risk or something that I was scared about. So when I was at Wachtell, I discovered that I enjoyed writing, I enjoyed blogging, I enjoyed doing it full time, not just as something I was doing in my spare time. But I felt I wasn't fully utilizing my talents or my knowledge that I had acquired during my legal career. I loved writing about the occasional Supreme Court issue when I was covering politics at Wachtell, but really it was mainly about politics. And I also discovered that I didn't know as much about politics as I thought I did, to be totally honest. So I thought to myself, you know what? What about a site like Wachtell for politics, but for the law? There were a couple of early legal blogs back then. I think How Appealing, which is a great appellate blog by Howard Bashman, Volatile Conspiracy, which is a great blog by some law professors, Overlawyered. There were a couple of early legal blogs back then, but not that many. Nothing that was really covering the profession itself, not just substantive law and doctrine, but the profession itself in a sort of insidery, fun way, much like Wachtell and much like Underneath Their Robes covered the federal judiciary. But Underneath Their Robes was focused just on judges. It wasn't talking about law firms or law schools or anything like that. So I came up with the idea for a website that would do this. And that was the website that eventually became Above the Law. And through networking in DC, I connected with some folks at a company now known as Breaking Media, which publishes a group of websites focused on different industries, including the law. And I pitched them on the idea and they liked it. And I was basically hired to launch it for them. I'm now, the stakeholders in Breaking Media. But yeah, that's kind of what led me to do that. But it was scary because I was essentially launching a completely brand new website and leaving a website that back then was very prominent, had a lot of traffic. And again, I was taking another risk and taking another pay cut too. And so that was scary as well.
Right. And did you launch it completely by yourself or did the funding provide like anybody else that worked with you on it?
No, it was pretty much just me. In the early days, in the first 2 years Above the Law, which launched in the summer of 2006, from basically 2006 to 2008, I was pretty much it. I think maybe at some point, maybe I got an intern or two, but really I was writing pretty much all the stories. I was editing. I was corresponding with all the readers. I was doing all the reporting. It was really a one-person show. So that was stressful as well. It's a lot of work to start something new. I mean, I know that some of the folks you talk to are people who do startup. This was in many ways a startup, and that is just such a huge venture.
And in those 2 years or in the beginning, I mean, did you start seeing it grow or success immediately? Or was it like, I don't know, in those first 2 years, was it a struggle getting it off the ground and getting readership?
So it was interesting. I think I was actually pleasantly surprised by how quickly it took. It was much smaller than it is today, but I got decent traffic off the bat. Even just a few weeks in, I think I was already getting more readers than I did at Underneath Their Robes. And so that was affirming. And I was able to in those first 2 years or so, pick up various stories that nobody else was really covering. For example, an associate pay raise that happened during that time. And Above the Law became in many ways a focal point or a distribution center for information about what was going on in terms of attorney compensation. And so there were a couple of stories like that I was able to really focus on in the early days, and I was pretty much the only person covering them. So I think that did help. And so the site did get good traction in terms of traffic. The challenge in the early years was revenue. We basically had, for the first 2 years, zero revenue. And so this is actually interesting. This was helpful to be working with a company and to be essentially doing it on behalf of investors as opposed to just doing it on my own. If I were doing it on my own, I would basically be funding myself. And I don't know if I would have stuck it out for 2 years without revenue if I were doing it myself. Now, there are advantages to starting something on your own. You're in complete control. You have total ownership. You see more of the financial upside, but there were also risks. That is something that someone has to calculate and take account of when you're leaving a profession like the law.
Right. Absolutely. And do you think that part of the reason that you got that funding or, Breaker Media took you on was your success with Underneath Their Robes, or I guess your notoriety with that?
Yes, I think that was a big selling point to the breaking media folks. The fact that I was already a known quantity, that I had readership from Underneath Their Robes and also Wachtell. Look, I think probably the idea for Above the Law was a good enough idea that there are probably a lot of people who could have done it. But in many ways, back in the summer of 2006, I was probably one of the best situated people to do it because I had been writing online by then for 2 or so years, which was an eternity back then. And I did have a following.
Right. Okay. And so kind of fast forwarding now, how has Above the Law grown in the last, 12 years? How many readers does it typically get monthly? How big of an organization is it now?
Yeah, so Above the Law now has gone from basically me working out of my spare bedroom in DC to about 10 full-time employees. We have 5 full-time writer-editors. We have 5 or so folks who do other things like technology, events, etc. And we have a lot of outside columnists now, which we didn't have back then. We have around 50 of them, and they write about different areas of the law, different practice settings. So the site has just so many more bylines, so much more content. Back in the day, I was writing, maybe 8 or so stories, and they would tend to be really, really short. Sometimes they might just be a quote and a joke. Mm-hmm. That was what blogging in many ways was like back in the early days. Now we publish 20 or more stories, and they're actually real stories. Some of them reflect a lot of reporting, interviewing, research, and they're way longer than a quotation and a joke. So it has grown tremendously. We get around, it varies from month to month, but we get, on a good month, we'll get more than 1 million unique visitors a month, maybe around 1.3 million unique visitors, which for a niche website focused on the legal profession is huge. We think that there are probably 1,003,000 or 4,000 practicing lawyers in the US. So we have very good market penetration. Now, granted, a lot of our readers are not lawyers, but people are just interested in the law students, people who come to us through search engines, what have you. But I think we are now very well known within the profession. So the site succeeded in many ways beyond my wildest imaginings. I was really hoping to just have a site that could essentially allow me to write and basically make a living. And now, basically, there are 10 of us who make a living off of it.
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, beyond, and I think, the lawyers listening obviously have an understanding. Every lawyer I know knows Above the Law and regularly follows it. I think for the non-lawyers listening, beyond the readership, which is incredible to have, over 1 million people visit a month, Above the Law has a lot of power kind of in the legal industry because what you guys run tends to affect, like you were saying, compensation. When you guys were publishing what one firm compensates their associates, it forced other firms to match that or whatnot, because then their associates would be upset or would leave and whatnot. And so I was reading an article, doing research for this interview, and one of the articles called you the most feared man in the legal profession. And I think that's incredible. I mean, to have that kind of reach and to, have that influence. I was wondering, did you ever expect that to happen?
No, that was also something that I did not expect. And we've tried to use it for good. We've tried to make the legal profession, which can often be opaque and confusing, more transparent. We try to help people who are maybe the first lawyer in their family learn more about what they might be getting into. So everything from helping people make more informed decisions about whether to go to law school, more informed than the one I made, to helping people know about what law firms pay, to also things like diversity, which we are hoping to increase by writing about it a lot, and it's giving positive shout outs to firms that are good on it and tisk-tisking firms that lag behind on it. Another example, this is perhaps less followed than compensation, but one issue that we covered where we made a difference is the issue of parental leave. Law firms give leave to associates when they start families. And when we started covering the issue, the standard leave, I think, was around 12 weeks. And we started highlighting firms that were offering more and more generous leave policies. And now the standard is somewhere around 20 weeks. And I think a lot of that was our doing just by letting people know, look, these are firms where if you do want to raise a family, not everyone does, but if you do, these are firms that are very family friendly. And in this very competitive market for talent, a lot of firms decided, you know what, we want to be on that side of the ledger.
Yeah, I think it's incredible. I mean, I know it was very helpful to me when I was practicing, and especially when I was in a big law firm. And I think that actually it would be so nice if most professions had something like this, because a lot of stuff happens in secret and a lot of decisions in businesses, like there's not a lot of transparency. And so I think as an associate, you don't tend to have a lot of bargaining power. And so to have somebody, it does seem like you guys are on, as much as you could say, like the little guy, associates are making hundreds of thousands of dollars, but you're on the, you're on their side. So it was very helpful. And I think that's why you guys have such a loyal following.
We also stick up for staff as well, I think.
Right.
They are often the people who make these law firms run and are overlooked. And we've talked about their compensation. We've talked about situations where they've been mistreated in an effort to perhaps avoid that in the future. We do stick up for staff as well as associates. We also will write positively about partners when they are doing things that are great as well. So we'd have nothing against partners. Right. In fact, some of our columnists are partners at law firms.
Right.
So yeah, just wanted to make that clear.
Yeah, no. Another thing I have to praise you guys for is that a lot of times certain political or I think legal blogs can tend to sway one way, either left or right. And I think you guys do a really good job of when you're talking about even the legal issues or Supreme Court rulings or whatnot, you guys do tend to have different voices, which isn't always the case. And I'm sure that isn't easy. I think that could be, I don't know how you guys manage that within yourselves, because I think in this day and age, political discourse has become not very civil. And so It is very admirable that you've been able to keep that up.
Yeah, we try, but you're right. It is hard. And I will be honest, it is harder now than it has been at any point. I think I'm probably somewhat more right of center or conservative among the editors, and some are in the middle, and then some are more off to the left, like Ali Mustal and Joe Patrice. This is a very tough time to be talking about political and legal issues. Of course, we strive for civility with each other, but we're not afraid to disagree. Just in the past few days, we've been mixing it up in the pages of Above the Law about the Supreme Court nomination of Brett Kavanaugh. So we do have different viewpoints, but it's tough.
Yeah.
It's a really tough time.
Well, and that's what I was going to ask you about too, is not only is it a tough time, but I think from when you started it to now, obviously there has been you call it like the coming up of social media, and with Twitter and all this stuff, there's a lot of very mean-spirited comments, and people, for whatever reason, behind a computer have more courage to say things that they wouldn't say. They're just not civil. So I just wonder, how have you dealt with that on a personal level? I'm sure you've been attacked. I'm sure you've gotten nasty things, because that's just the nature of what Twitter is today. And for the stuff that you're putting out, you really are putting out what your opinions are on certain things, your political opinion. And so how do you deal with that today?
You mean in terms of polarization or?
Yeah, just not only polarization, but I think a lot of times from different people I've talked to that have to have more of a public presence, a lot of times it can be just wearing on you personally, in the sense that people there's a lot of personal attacks. If let's say you're...
Oh, yes. Yeah. No, totally. And so, a couple of things. You mentioned mean-spirited comments. One thing that we did at Above the Law a couple of years ago is we used to have a reader comment section where people would comment on articles. And unfortunately, it wasn't just at Above the Law, but as time went on, these reader comments at many websites just got less and less civil. So a couple of years ago, I'm forgetting exactly when, we removed those comments. One reason we did that, besides them becoming more uncivil, was people are now commenting more on social media, Facebook, Twitter. They post an article, they comment on it. And There, the discourse tends to be somewhat more civil because usually people are writing under their real names, although lately even Twitter has become and Facebook can become a bit fraught. I think that's one issue. I guess a second thing is I, for myself, always try to be civil when dealing with other folks, even folks I disagree with. People have different styles of argumentation, but I try to make it about the argument rather than about the person. But as we were discussing, it's a challenging time right now.
Yeah. So now moving ahead, you stepped down as the managing editor of Above the Law last year. Can you tell us now what your role is and why you decided to do that?
A year ago, in October of last year, my husband and I welcomed our son into the world. And that led me to want to have a schedule that was a bit more flexible. And when you're managing editor, you're pretty much on all the time. When breaking news happens, you need to write about it or figure out who's going to write about it. This news cycle is exhausting. There's always something going on. So that was one reason I wanted a role that would allow me to have more flexibility, spend more time with our child, our baby. And the second thing is, after 11 or so years in the trenches of day-to-day journalism, to be honest, I think I was a little burned out. I think I wanted to do something different and I wanted to stretch some different muscles. So I handed over the reins. I'm no longer involved in day-to-day management of the site. Ali Mistal is the new head of the site. I think his title is now executive editor, but he pretty much performs the role I used to perform. I'm now editor at large, which means that I write when I'm inclined to. I tend to do more long-form pieces now as opposed to the quick hits that I used to do, although I will sometimes do something short and quick, but most of the time they tend to be longer pieces. And I've also taken on a bit of a business role. I help out a little bit on the business side of the website. And of course, whenever I do, that's always disclosed. Like if I'm working on something sponsored and, we have to disclose that consistent, we're lawyers, have to disclose that consistent with FTC rules. But that's basically my new role. And I also will still do things to promote the site, interviews like this one, engagements, things like that. I also sometimes write for outside publications, print publications. So I continue to do that. And I hope to do more of that. Past few months, I've written for the New York Times, Wall Street Journal. And in 2015, I published a book, Supreme Ambitions, and I want to work on a second book. And so I'm hoping that this role will also give me the time and the headspace to work on another book. It's very hard to work on a book when just running around putting out fires all the time.
That absolutely makes sense, especially once you have a kid. Congratulations on your son.
Thank you.
But it's nice to know that you're still involved with Above the Law and you're still working there, but you're just not doing, a lot of the day-to-day. And I think that makes sense after 12 years of doing that kind of intense work. So what would you say? I think a lot of people want to start something else. There's a lot of lawyers that are unhappy. There's a lot of people in other professions, but I feel like every time I talk to somebody about someone like you, it's like, oh yeah, well, he started in 2006 when blogging was just coming out. Now blogging is so saturated, or now social media is so saturated. There's no way for me to break in. What would you say to that? Do you think that's true?
Look, I guess I'm going to give a kind of mixed answer, the lawyerly, it depends. So on the one hand, it is a tougher environment. I think one of the reasons Above the Law became so successful was just luck. We launched early before this. And so it wasn't just, oh, how fabulous we were. There was this opportunity that was unfilled. So I do think that, yes, it is harder in some ways to be heard above the noise ascending. But on the other hand, this is a saying I think my grandfather liked to tell my mom, and I think there's some truth to it. There's always room at the top. If you are doing something that is very well done, that is very well executed, or if you do come up with an idea that is original and new, and those ideas still exist. I remember when I was Wachtell, or maybe this was around this time, there was a website and publication that launched called Politico. And I kind of thought, wow, there's already so much politics covered. The New York coverage was the Washington Post, Daily Kos, Wachtell, whatever. Is this website really going to succeed? And now, years later, Politico is wildly successful.
Right.
So it's interesting how there is this appetite. And when you think, oh, there's people who don't want that, well, lo and behold, maybe they do.
Right. No, absolutely. I think that is great advice. And I think, like you said, while it is harder to break through the noise, that people are now, back in the day, I think in 2006, there was also challenges that they don't have today. Like you were saying, a lot of times people weren't even making money as bloggers, or everybody wasn't used to visiting websites or being on their phone and reading news all the time. Whereas now there's certain advantages that you didn't have back then. So it's, a mixed bag.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There are totally a lot of advantages. Social media, which is a great way to promote what you do, didn't really exist back then. In terms of online advertising, a lot of advertisers were just unfamiliar with it. And now more and more ad dollars are moving to digital. So there are a lot more opportunities as well.
Well, thank you so much, David. This has been one of my favorite interviews. I think you've given some really great advice, and I've loved hearing about your story. Why don't you let people know where they can follow you or get in touch with you?
You can still read me at abovelaw.com. I think I also have a page where all of my articles are collected. I think it's abovelaw.com/David-Lat. I'm on Twitter. You can find me at David Lat, 1 T at the end. And I can be reached by email at dlat@abovelaw.com. I'm always happy to hear from people. I should mention again, since I'm no longer managing editor, I'm not really involved in general goings-on at the site. But if you have comments on something I've written, I always love hearing from readers.
Well, thank you. I will link to all those in the show notes in case people want to grab those links. Again, thank you so much, David. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Goldie. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks so much, David. Bye-bye. Thank you so much for listening. I can't tell you how much it means to me. If you liked the podcast, please rate and review us on iTunes. It'll help other people find the show. If you want to connect or reach out, follow along on Instagram and Facebook at Lessons from a Quitter and on Twitter at Quitter Podcast. I would love to hear from you guys, and I'll see you on the next episode.